Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Kim Strassel here with Monet Ukwabarua and Alicia Finley. Alicia, the New York Court of Appeals a couple of years ago ordered a redrawn congressional map for New York and the 2022 midterms that produced one of the most politically competitive elections in that state in decades. Republicans ended up winning 11 out of 26 districts, victories that contributed to its narrow hold on Congress right now. Yet that same Court of Appeals, albeit with different justices, on Tuesday threw out that court-ordered map and ordered the state's redistricting commission to draw a new one that is very likely going to once again lock in a lot more seats for Democrats. Can you give us some of the tortured political backstory of all this?
So this all goes back to actually 2014, believe it or not, when New Yorkers passed a constitutional amendment that banned partisan gerrymandering and established a 10-member bipartisan redistricting commission for Democrats, for Republicans, and then two independent members. Now, a lot of states actually have now these bipartisan redistricting commissions in various forms, and some are more independent than others. If you look actually in California, it's been totally taken over by the left, and they are co-opted to draw maps that favor Democrats. But in this case, this independent commission actually deadlocked. Not surprising, because it was basically split half and half, Democrat or Republican. Then after the commission deadlocked, the Democratic legislature stepped in and drew an egregious gerrymander that gave Democrats an advantage in 22 of 26 seats. And recall, Democrats actually lost a couple of seats in the reapportionment after the 2020 census because of population decline. Now, this 22 out of 26 seats amounts to about 85% of seats. Joe Biden only won 61% of the vote in New York in 2020. And you would actually expect in a state like New York, where liberals are kind of packed into cities, that Republicans would actually have larger share of the seats proportionate to the popular vote, just because of the geography. And that's actually been the case in a lot of states, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and other states where you have, again, Democrats packed into big cities. Republicans actually tend to do better. But actually the opposite occurred here, and actually proportionately, Democrats were hugely advantaged. Now, again, the U.S. Supreme Court hasn't required proportional representation. In fact, they've gotten out of the political thicket completely of adjudicating political gerrymanders here. But the issue wasn't just on a proportionate basis that Democrats had or were advantaged in more seats. The issue was that these districts that the legislature drew defied traditional redistricting principles. And by that means that they weren't exactly compact. They didn't keep communities intact. They kind of stretched the district lines in ways that, I like to joke that, it would have made Elbridge Gerry, who was the Massachusetts governor whose namesake gave forth to the term gerrymander, proud. And so to fast forward, those maps were challenged, and this New York Supreme Court, known as the Court of Appeals, stepped in, basically struck them down as a partisan gerrymander, and had a court-appointed special master redraw them for the 22 election. But of course, Democrats weren't happy, and so when the Court of Appeals justices stepped down last year, Democrats mounted a new lawsuit. Again, to Kim's point, this was a very tortured history. But a new justice was seated on the Supreme Court, and that gave them a 4-3 majority. However, as it turns out, that judge had to recuse herself, and a lower district court judge was brought up who was very progressive to hear this case. So no surprise, they came out 4-3 with a new progressive majority that ordered the redistricting commission to redraw maps. Now, invariably, what's going to happen is that they deadlock again, and then the legislature is going to be able to step in and redraw the maps on their own and redraw another egregious gerrymander that the progressive high court, or the new progressive high court majority, is going to uphold.
I'd just like to point out how little role it seemed to be played anywhere in that narrative, Alicia, of this, quote, bipartisan redistricting commission. I think this story really shows the degree to which, this has now become pure politics and partisan politics. Republicans are certainly taking it that way. Let's listen to two New York Republican congressmen, both in districts that would likely be affected by a new map. The first is Mike Lawler, and the second is Anthony D'Esposito.
It's corruption at its finest. We had a ruling last year that overturned the Democrats' attempts to gerrymander New York's maps and violate the Constitution. And because they didn't like the outcome, they decided that they would do it once more.
Democrats, quite frankly, know that they can't win fairly at the ballot box, so they're trying to win elections in the courtroom. They wanted the maps thrown out so they could gerrymander and create solid Democrat districts to try to diminish the stronghold that the Republicans have put in 2022.
This obviously goes to elections. It's all about elections. And Republicans didn't have the blowout midterm that they were hoping last time around, despite Joe Biden's lack of popularity. A lot of factors in that, including Democrats successfully tying candidates to Donald Trump, Republican candidates who struggled with the abortion issue. So it really mattered to Republicans in the end. It was a bit of a saving grace that there was this map in New York. And even though the state is certainly a blue state, there are pockets of conservative voters, and this map made for some truly competitive races. Republicans ended up flipping 4 seats. If you consider that they only have a 3-seat majority in the House right now, obviously those New York successes were crucial. And I think that that's the context for understanding those frustrated comments by the Republicans we just heard. How much do you think, Monet, this is going to matter, this ultimate map, to Republicans in next year's elections? Are we at a stage now where these partisan gerrymandering exercises become consequential in who has control of the House?
Well, it's probably going to matter a great deal. I think it's ironic that we were talking about some of these moderate Republican House members in the previous segment regarding their willingness to vote for the impeachment inquiry. And now we've just heard from a couple of them. They are stacked in New York State for exactly the reasons that you and Alicia have gone through. That map that was implemented by the court master made it much more competitive and created a much more fair map than the previous gerrymandered one that the court tossed out, and allowed some real competitive balance in New York State, which is a very competitive place. You do have a stark political difference between New York City and a lot of the suburbs that are close to it and a lot of the rural regions. And Republicans are very competitive as long as the districts are drawn somewhat fairly. And so you have folks like Mike Lawler, who won by less than 2,000 votes, I believe, in the Hudson Valley district where he ran in 2022. You have Anthony D'Esposito, who I believe won by a little under 10,000 votes in his Long Island district, and several other of these new freshman representatives who were able to succeed because the map was much more fair and allowed for a balance of Republican voters with some of the Democratic voters in these inner ring areas around New York City. If the Democrats are able to gerrymander again, it's very likely that it won't take much work for them to completely redraw these districts. And of course, as we know, the Republican House majority has become so slim that that could absolutely be the decisive factor. So I don't think Americans expect these decisions being made in state legislatures and courtrooms to be the determining factor of who has control of Congress. The expectation is that the districts make a certain amount of geographic and political sense, and that the will of the voters is going to prevail and be decisive. But because we have gotten into this thick legal territory of disputes over all of these maps, it is increasingly the case that these courtroom decisions are determining the outcome of the House races and control of the House as a consequence.
Yeah, as you say, Monet, all of these maps, because Alicia, this isn't just isolated to New York. You mentioned that this saga in New York traced back to 2014. Actually, you can trace it back farther than that. I trace it back to Eric Holder, the former attorney general, and that infamous thumping that Democrats got in Barack Obama's first midterms. That made a real impression on them and kind of was a starting gun for these gerrymandering effort, because when Eric Holder left office, he created an entire group that just became focused on state legislature elections, because those are the bodies that, in theory, draw the maps in many cases. Increasingly, the left has become, and now the right, very involved in state Supreme Court elections because they adjudicate these maps. This is the new game, and it's not just happening in New York, is it? I know you've written about other states where we're seeing the same phenomenon.
Right. I mean, they're looking at what they're doing in Wisconsin is with the new progressive majority on Wisconsin Supreme Court. Now they're looking to overturn the maps based on the argument that these are political gerrymanders. Wherever they have a Supreme Court majority, liberals are now taking these same kind of cookie cutter claims, making them arguing that there are partisan gerrymanders and that they're unconstitutional under the state constitutions. Recall that the Supreme Court several years ago actually decided to, I think I mentioned earlier, get out this political thicket. And so you can no longer make these kinds of partisan gerrymander claims that in federal court. Not only that, I would also say some of this goes back to the U.S. Supreme Court Shelby County v. Holder decision in 2013, where the Supreme Court basically said that the federal government no longer had to pre-clear maps under the Voting Rights Act. And that kind of gave the Justice Department a veto on a lot of state maps and provided also more grounds for liberal groups to challenge some of these maps. So now without that tool, they're essentially now, instead of arguing that these are racial gerrymanders, now they're arguing that they're partisan gerrymanders. And again, they're doing it in many states that are closely divided: Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, they've done North Carolina. And then the alternative is, as you point out, is that they're trying to create these independent redistricting commissions and then trying to game them like they have in California. But they've also set these commissions in other states where you have Republican legislatures and governors, like in Ohio, where they know they're not going to be able to essentially challenge these maps and at the Supreme Court because there's also a conservative majority there. So instead, they set up these redistricting commissions and hope that they'll be able to at least exploit them to draw maps more favorable to them.
Yeah, all of which portends many more podcasts on this subject to come. So thank you, Alicia. Thank you, Monet. We thank our listeners. We remind you that we are here every weekday. We'll be back tomorrow. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. And if you like the show, please hit the subscribe button. Thank you.